Hi, I'm David Partika, and I created CSS Burner as a tool for rapid CSS optimization. And today I'd like to show you a strategy for looking at your style sheet in a different way using the statistical analysis function, which is on the top here. So I've already pasted a style sheet of about 700 kilobytes in length. I've pasted this into the text area. And so let's select from the drop-down, let's select property value functions and the number of occurrences to get some insight into this style sheet. And let's see what the data tells us. So I click on the Analyze button, and here, we see a nice distribution of different functions, of different CSS functions. And to get the counts, of course, we would just mouse over each one. Now, this data is telling me a couple of things. One is that it's pretty clear to me that whoever wrote this style sheet, the authors are pretty advanced with the use of CSS functions, because there's a pretty good distribution of different types of functions here. But so that would tell me right away that the presentation for whatever is public facing and the style sheet, helps style. The presentation is very important for this site, whatever site that this style sheet is for. Another thing that this data tells me is that we see that there are several transform functions here. There's scale 3D, scale, rotate, matrix, and cubic Bezier function, which for animation. So it seems like animations and transforms are very important for the style sheet. So I would surmise that there are lots of moving parts as part of the user experience. Lots of different windows that move or slide down, or sections that rearrange themselves somehow, so that I would surmise that the visual experience that one gets at the public facing site is pretty impressive. Now, what supports that, also the visual aspect being important here, is that the linear gradient function is also used. So clearly there are some background images that this site finds important, but also URL. The URL function can also be used for things like background images. So this all fits into the idea that that animation and that the presentation of the site for the public is very key to the success of this application. Now, one thing that I would suggest, just looking at this data, is that there are other transform functions that are out there that, if animation is so important, there might be other opportunities. Now, these are only the top 8 functions, so perhaps there are others that I'm missing. So one thing that I might suggest, just looking at this data, or one thing I might surmise if this was my style sheet, I would say, oh, perhaps linear translations are something that we've not thought about, or that our application could use to enhance the UX, because we see that the translate function is nowhere to be found here. And there's translate X, Y, translate 3D, there's translate Z, I believe, as well. So that would be one thing. I also noticed that the skew function, there's skew X, and skew Y. Skew is absent. So I feel like that's an underutilized function. Perhaps there could be some kind of fancy visual animation that could call into play skew function as another possibility. This data shows that the authors ran the gamut with transform functions, but they glaringly did not include translate and skew. So there may be a reason for that, and that's the power too of statistical analysis, is that the user whoever the author is knows their style sheet, and then they can answer those questions. So it's personalized insight. In this case, why is translate not here, but all the other, or many of the other transform functions are present. So that's one thing that the data tells me, or that I could surmise from the data. I could additionally surmise from the data, we see that the RGBA usage here, there's 82 occurrences. Now, some people would argue that the HSL or HSLA color functions are more useful than RGB and RGBA. And the authors of the style sheet, if they ever came to that conclusion, they might be able to look at this data and say, oh, there are opportunities to change from RGBA to HSL or HSLA, and perhaps this is something that can now make maintenance of the entire style sheet, as far as the color aspect, could make it much easier. Because, as I said, I have heard HSLA in particular described as much more intuitive. So that's what this data tells me. I also see other omissions here. For example, crossfade. Crossfade is a more recent CSS function. Radial gradient. Radial gradient is not here. I find that there are less opportunities to use radial gradient because objects tend to be in CSS more oriented in a rectangular fashion. That seems to be the thought process instead of a circular type of fashion. But this data also tells us that there could be animation and visual display opportunities for other image type functions, such as I said, radial gradient and crossfade, and maybe in the future conical gradients. So this is an example of how you can use the property value function statistical analysis in your style sheets to gain insight that would be difficult to gain in any other way, or if so, it would be much slower. We were able to gather this data in a matter of seconds. So this is the power of the statistical analysis function, and a strategy, and how you can use this for strategies for your own style sheet. So if you found this video on strategies useful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Optimize CSS channel. That is the official channel of CSS Burner. And look for more strategy videos in the future.